The best beginner skirmish game. Look, a healthy war game is a war game you can actually get games of because enough people play it, okay? We all know it. And so, whatever game you consider your main and you want to make people play, you've got to consider your pipeline. How can you give people a good piping, if you will? Every journey starts with a single pipe step. So even if your goal is a massive 50,000 point game of Apocalypse that takes several weeks to play, what is the first step? Because I'm going to tell you this right now, it's not just playing the first turn of that game. You start small, and the smallest form of wargaming is skirmish gaming, right? And in today's video, I want to make the case for Deadzone from Mantic and why it should be in every capital G gamer's roster of wargames to entice unwitting players into wasting all of their life savings on small chunks of plastic. I propose that it straddles the line of board game and war game, making it the perfect entry to skirmish gaming and why that is so crucial for a successful game. I want to tell you my idea of what new players gel with in wargaming, how Deadzone fits in with this, what veteran players can engage with, and then kind of explain what Deadzone actually is and scratch the surface of the mechanics. It's not a how to play, it's just a generic, right? But I'm going to do that in the opposite order of what I just said, because if you don't have a frame of reference, you'll just kind of be super lost here. So let's talk mechanics. Deadzone is the kind of game that if you get into, you'll start claiming that you are burning for the skirmin, okay? That the only shape missing from the kill team measurement widget is a cube, and maybe every game should use D8s. Okay, anyway, back on track, right? Deadzone, like most wargame systems, is very simple when you look at the core of the game, but builds itself up in complexity when you look at the extent of its list building and different stat lines and abilities that can be played. Okay, nice. Let's start with the basics. It is alternating activations, uses a 3D grid for all measurements, and a bonus dice pool system. Let's start with everyone's favourite clicky-clacky math rocks. Let's start with everyone's favourite clicky-clacky math rocks, okay? It uses exploding D8s. Exploding dice, for those that don't know, mean that if you roll an 8, you get to roll an additional dice. And that dice can also explode. I've seen at tournaments, some have an award for the first person who rolls 3 explodes off a single dice. There are no maths involved with the dice system as well. Very rarely are there modifiers to the number you need to roll on the dice. If you need a 4 to hit, then you pretty much always need a 4 to hit. The benefits and negatives come in the form of getting to roll more or fewer, dice based on certain things. If you're a level above the target, you get +1 dice. If you charged, that's +1 dice. That sort of thing. Being in the right place or doing the right thing gives you more dice. Being out in the open or doing the wrong thing gives you less dice. Fewer dice? I don't know. Also, every roll has a base of 3 dice. Shooting, melee, armor, it doesn't need to define how many attacks a machine gun gets compared to a shotgun, because everything gets 3 dice by default. And what you need to roll is always the number on your stat line. Easy and fun. And then you simply compare the number of successes the attacker rolls to the number of successes the defender rolls, and every extra success from the attacker is the damage dealt. Easy peasy. So it's alternating activations, but I really don't feel much needs to be said on that. Every skirmish game is alternating activations, right? Like, if it's been made in the last 20 years, it is alternating activations. So I'll very briefly talk about actions. Every model can make either 2 short actions or 1 long action in its activation. You know how it is. Short actions are advance, stand up, shoot, special action, and long actions are sprint and assault. You know, the standard. Essentially meaning you have 2 actions you can make, but some of those are compound actions. Okay, right. Let's talk about the 3D grid. The board is 2 foot by 2 foot. My personal take for the largest a skirmish game should be, by the way. Fits on the kitchen table or a local coffee shop or a pub table. Just. The starter set comes with a paper mat, but for a small fee you can pick up a neoprene mat. On these mats you have a square grid, 8 by 8, so 4-inch squares. However, the game is played in cubes, not squares, because of course height exists and is fun, and works brilliantly with their cubular terrain. Terrain in a moment. Measuring. Let's talk measuring. Super simple. You move X squares and your gun has a range of Z squares. You need to be in the same square to melee. And I struggle to explain the fun in this, but let me show you a square and how line of sight works because it's kind of beautiful, okay? Here is a model and he wants to move 3 squares forwards into this square. He is on a small size base and there are then rules about what size of a wall hole he can move through because of that. So this side of the square is completely walled up. This side has a hole he could climb through, and forwards we have a door. Okay, this is feeling a little bit choose your own adventure, and that would be an interesting idea to explore in another video, but not the point. We go forwards, then we go diagonally. Now this square has some scatter terrain and walls around it. We can place our model anywhere here, but the square doesn't have any intrinsic properties. It isn't like it counts as a square with light cover or square with heavy cover. The game still uses a pretty standard true line of sight. And so where you place your model within the cube and where you are being shot from defines your defense bonus. This system removes all forms of fiddly measurements but still allows for tactical movement and placement decisions. How often in other games have you measured to the closest piece of terrain and realise you're a quarter of an inch out and so have to rethink your move? A millimetre out of combat range that leads you to calling a judge to measure for you, right? Deadzone simply doesn't have that. I love the cube measuring. It makes all of your movement and attacks instantly clear with 0 measuring widgets required. Never will you need a board full of threat range measurements, okay? And to achieve this, all they've really done is mechanically said, it doesn't matter if you move 8 inches or 12, do whichever is best for you. The precision doesn't matter, the choice matters. And frankly, I can't think of a game that doesn't also want to use that as their slogan, right? Your choice is what matters. Am I pro-choice? No, don't say that. And manages to implement it so simply in the mechanics. Oh, right, a minor note on terrain, okay? This is more Necromunda than Kill Team. This is the more the better. Every cube should have at least one thing in it, and ideally you want multiple stacks at 3 floors or higher. Getting the bonus of a totally clear shot on an enemy should be through outmaneuvering them and be very hard to get. And I've mentioned the cubular terrain, and of course that works great, but you can play without it. Octarius, Sector Imperialis, Sector Mechanicus, it all works with the system. It can just be, a little bit less obvious than using the precisely designed cubes from Mantic. Aesthetic taste always differs, right? But I actually honestly really like my bright white futuristic utopia painted set that I did for them. I think it looks really cool. Looks good. Feels good to play on. So let's roll off that onto why Deadzone is the best game for introducing new players to wargaming. With the rise of general geekery, sounds like an evil villain's name, but ignore that. With the rise of general geekery being more and more acceptable in the lives of even those who are not dyed-in-the-wool geek lords like us, wargaming and specifically playing wargames is still right at the bottom of the list of acceptability, okay? Just above being a stamp collector, pretty much, if I'm honest. Now, console gaming isn't even of note these days. It's expected. Computer gaming? Okay, sure. My man went hard into COD instead of Halo, fair enough. Board games, people grew up on that. Monopoly, not very interesting, but there's a frame of reference. And they guess chess is for smart people and smart is good, they guess. Oh, but this one is rated by Mensa as being good for intelligence and it's not chess. And I did make people laugh when I got drunk and played Cards of Humanity, for humanity. So I guess that kind of links together, right? D&D seems pretty geeky, but hey, look at these incredibly attractive, rich and talented people playing it online. And there's a pretty damn good movie that made me laugh as well called D&D. Well, I do like looking at hot people doing fun things, and they roll dice sometimes, so that's probably connected. You see the pipeline, the flow chart is what I'm saying, right? The logical jumps are what is needed to ease people into playing wargames. And so anything that a wargame can have that links it back up to a higher tier of acceptability is a positive. We don't want entry friction, if you know what I mean. I'm not going to make a joke about that. I will die on this hill, okay? Having to go to a hardware shop to buy a tape measure is cringe for your game. The act of measuring is bad. Step up from that and you have custom measuring widgets. Now I like these actually. They may make the act of measuring something unique to the game instead of an outside requirement. My heart, however, will forever belong to template-based movement in X-Wing. Hashtag love it. But a great middle ground between board games and wargames is grid movement. The Deadzone system maintains the tactical flexibility that wargamers like with free measured movement, and the ease of board game-like grid movement. And with this grid movement, I'm going to say it again, it legit doesn't matter if you knock terrain or your models a bit. Terrain is on a grid line, models are obviously placed. It's honestly the best middle ground I've seen in a skirmish game. All the benefits, none of the downsides. Also, the downsides are purely in your head and like preconceived notions, but not the point. Brief anecdote as to why I'm so hot for grids. Last week, and damn, last week, wow, the script is old, I was on holiday and I wanted to teach a friend who had never played any form of wargame how to play. I taught them both Kill Team and War Machine. Super stripped back forms of them, at least. When teaching these games to someone with no frame of reference, the dice make sense, and primarily that's what you're teaching them, right? The order of rolling dice to see what effect happens on the board. I mean, D&D beats any wargame for dice understanding, but like that's a different topic. I've talked about that with my patrons, but whatever. But saying you can move anywhere and it will have this huge flowchart of possible effects is incredibly unintuitive in games where precise positioning matters, but with zero guidance on how. I couldn't help myself from wishing I was teaching them a board game like Underworlds or Deadzone or rigidly defined movement such as X-Wing. It just felt total freeform movement is not like in any way a benefit to a beginner to wargaming. As soon as you have a grid to work with, whether that be Deadzone or Underworlds or Judgment or Riot Quest or Monster Apocalypse or God Tier, or any number of more traditional board games, so much is added with almost nothing being taken away. When it comes to teaching new to the genre players, that is, obviously, that's what I'm talking about here. How you and a vet can get new players in, right? Whether you have Deadzone's flexible hybrid of measurement where you measure the cubes but then the final placement is free, or you have predefined hexes that hold a certain trait, these are systems I love to see in games. Okay, I've gone on about grids for too long, let's continue. I just think they're neat. Deadzone 2 has starter sets. Doesn't matter which one you like, they just have different factions in them, so you pick up the one you want based on factions as the rest of the contents are the same. I won't go back to talking about the grid, but I do want to highlight the mat that these come with, wherever they are on screen. Paper, not premium mouse pad, yes, but while one side is the full 2x2 board, the other side is a really nice get started board. It gives you essentially a starter guide with the rules you need to know all around it, and then a smaller board in the middle with marked out terrain. So if you were saving the terrain building for last, but have the models ready to go, here you have it. This is a really thoughtful use of space. Better than just alternate artwork, you know, but mechanically the same. Then we get the books in the starter box. Core rules and fluff, then your army list and list building book. From a rules perspective, that's it. That's the entire game. There's no expansions or campaign books. It's a closed system. Mantic doesn't have an app, but it does have a browser-based rulebook and list builder along with tournament calendar that anyone can add events to. And they do add rules or additional units or army lists and like do an FAQ, but we're talking like once a year, not once a month. While we're discussing the army list book, I will touch on what I think is the biggest negative of Deadzone. Okay? For the rules, which is the graphic design. Okay, it's looking dated. A long row of numbers isn't fun or engaging. Even if we assume that every number on this data sheet needs to be on here, it's already like as Spartan as it could possibly be. This is a very old school layout, and there are hundreds of games that have taken the same amount of information and made it significantly more readable. Like, genuinely, my legit only criticism of this entire game system is this one thing. For what the game is, the layout of stats is aggressive and ugly and in my opinion from a previous generation of wargames, unlike the rest of the rule set, which is top tier. Finally, we come to the models and the world of Warpath. Mantic as a company has just started to make a move forwards into injection molded plastic of a similar quality to Games Workshop, but that's only for its most recent releases. Everything in Deadzone is from various different eras of Mantic, so some are resin, some are low def plastic. If you're a die-hard hobbyist that really values crisp sculpts and details, then in truth, they're not the models for you. The miniatures, although being good representations of what they are not particularly crisp and filled with details. I will say that as game pieces, they work perfectly well, and if you find an aesthetic you like, they work just as well as Games Workshop models from a play perspective. From 3 feet away, they look just as good, if not better than GW, right? Like, they're fine. But I know that people love to put a camera like 1 inch away from a model and judge it from that distance. Not my thing, hence why I don't care about this aspect, but as I'm aware there's a hobby outside just being a damn good game, it does need to be said. Personal hot take though, Mantic provides a flat MDF base, and getting your own 3D printed bases makes them instantly look significantly better. Framing the model always works, and the MDF coins Mantic packages like the models with just, in my opinion, isn't adequate. And you can always proxy models, by the way, you know, like literally the game's made for it. Space Marines are Enforcers, Imperial Guard are GCPS, Eldar or Necrons are Asterians. It's really obvious. But I do have to also point out that, you know, if you like the product, support the company in some way. Mantic's new plastic models are great quality, basically like identical to GW sprues. So look at those, I guess, if you're into models. Finally, a brief note on the universe of Warpath. I'm gonna say that it's generic sci-fi, right? Universe is run by corporations. The models that look like modern day army men or Imperial Guard are owned by corporations. A new faction called Maison Labs is clearly aping Amazon because it's a giant corporation that experiments on the population. And there's space dwarves, space skaven, space orcs, and space elves, but they like to fight in robots from orbit, so you're fighting advanced robot drones, not the actual elves, but sometimes the elves. And the Space Marines of the setting are the Enforcers, who are a private military force for only the richest. And the universe has books too, by the way. One of them is free, which I read, and actually, honestly, I quite liked it. It was, yeah, wasn't bad. Free book. Warpath is the kind of universe where it's kind of all close enough to the modern world and modern ethics that you could just imagine they're regular soldiers if you fancy it. Very relatable. And if you want some schlocky, brain-dead sci-fi action fun, I think the free novel is pretty great, yeah. I don't really like the grimdark, and there are very few books in the Games Workshop universe that have let me enjoy them. So this is a great change of pace, and okay, it might not be as good as other sort of sci-fi books like Scalzi's Old Man's Wars series or Backer's Deathstalker, but it's a nice pulpy sci-fi world that I would much prefer to mentally inhabit than a grimdark snooze fest. And there you go. That's the end of my hotly contested argument for Deadzone being the best wargame to introduce new players into wargaming. And in contrast to my opening where I said that every journey begins with a single step, I think it has to be said that Deadzone doesn't have to be just your first step. The beauty of wargames tends to be their depth in comparison to board games. So Deadzone could easily be your first and last step, because really, what more do you need? It could be as small as 8 models or as massive as a few hundred if you want to collect every possible iteration of lists because you find out you just love it so much. There you go. That's it, that's Deadzone. I think it's really good. I genuinely think if you're a gamer, a capital G gamer like me, and you want to get friends into wargaming, not board games, not card games, not computer games, wargames, Deadzone is how you do it. Okay, well, thanks for watching, everybody. Go check out Mantic. If you're watching this right now, they currently have a Kickstarter on in the Warpath universe, but for their version of 40k Epic. It's really good value. You get a lot of models. Maybe you'd like that. Very different. It's nothing to do with Deadzone. It just happens to be there. Check that out if you want. Personally, I'm all about the Deadzone. All right. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy.